Sometimes something happens on Twitter that requires a response that Twitter is just not ready to handle. For that, we have YouTube. So, the other day, a guy who goes by the moniker of the Star Wars Apologist 1 posted a thread on his thoughts on The Last Jedi, and specifically Luke Skywalker. And my first thought, holy shit, dude, 24 posts? Twitter is not meant for this kind of conversation. But since he tagged me specifically, as me and him have been discussing it earlier in the day, I wanted to reply to him. I'm not going to do this on Twitter. As fun as Twitter is, this is too long. So I got his permission to post his comments and his screen name here. If you want to comment on his thread, please remember to be respectful, as he has been respectful to me in this entire conversation. We have polar opposite opinions, but that doesn't mean we can't get along. I'm also going to try and not use any kind of an annoying voice to read his thread. Try. In this thread, I'd like to discuss Luke in The Last Jedi, the most controversial thing one could talk about in Star Wars. It's kind of up there for sure. I think Rey is probably more controversial, or Rose, but I mean, if you're talking about actual canon-wise, like character-wise, yeah, it's going to be Luke. Now, this thread isn't meant to change how you feel about Luke, or your opinion on the film. This is just to show that Luke is consistent with this character. Now, calm down, everyone. Let's hear him out first. So, with that in mind, I will begin. So first, I think it's best to establish what consistency is. Consistency, when it comes to a character, has the character go through an arc. Change can happen to this character, and he can still be consistent, as long as the change is justified by the thing in question. More or less, I agree. Like, I wouldn't say Vader is consistent with Anakin from The Phantom Menace. He goes through an arc that changes him. I agree. I have always been confused by people that say that Anakin in The Phantom Menace saying yippee completely destroys the character of Vader. The worst people imaginable in history were still children at one point. Pointing that out doesn't ruin their arc, it just shows how far they fell. So with that established, we can move on. So with this in mind, as long as the Luke from The Last Jedi has a justified change, he is consistent, despite how on the island he has drastically changed. Again, no argument here so far. And with The Last Jedi, Luke, we have the event in question in which he changes. The third version, or Luke's second telling, of what happened in the hut. Now, some like to debate if we can even know what happened, or if Kylo's version was right, but that is completely different discussion altogether. So for the sake of brevity, dude, your post is 24 tweets long. What would the long form of this look like? For the sake of brevity, we'll take the third story as the accurate and correct version. I would agree that in the movie, this is designed to be the accurate version. Any confusion on this stems from the movie being poorly made. So in it, we see Luke looking into Ben. He sees Ben will destroy everything he loves. Everything. Not even just Leia, Han, Chewie, but everything he's ever cared about. Then he turns on the saber to him in the briefest of moments. That briefest of moment is going to be where the problem comes up. But I'll continue reading his thread until there is a natural stopping point, and then I'll discuss. Then he realizes right then what he had done and was put into shame, and put the fandom into one hell of an uproar. And with no time to explain to Ben what happened, Ben traps him in debris and kills half of his students. Side argument. How exactly did he miss that Luke survived this? How did Luke not manage to keep the roof up? But again, side arguments. He created the monster he so feared Ben would become. Now, the first object is that Luke would never do that as a master. I personally would argue that Luke would never do that as a character, first off, as a Jedi, second off, and as a master, thirdly. Over the years, he would have trained for enough self-control as to not freak out over this threat. He also would have known that the future is not set. That's in The Empire Strikes Back.
difficult to see. Always in motion is the future.
That's an important part of what makes this whole thing not make sense. Over the years, he would have trained for enough self-control as to not freak out over this threat. It's been 30 years. He should have known better. I honestly get the impression that Kylo Ren is actually roughly 30 around Force Awakens in the movies, and that in the scene at the temple, he's actually closer to 15. So I think it would have been between 15 and 20 years between Return of the Jedi and that scene happening. But even with that, he should have still known better. That's the main gripe that we have. To me, this isn't a great objection. It reminds me of a certain defense of Luke that I don't take. It's been 30 years, so he'd have changed. He could have changed into the person who would kill Kylo. Yeah, if you're going to make that kind of change in a character, you really need to fill that time gap with something, or it's going to feel really jarring. Could Luke have changed in that time period? Sure. But would we need to see it? Hell yes. That isn't justified from what we see itself. Is it possible? Sure. But it's not established. Great minds think alike. So, neither is Luke learning to not react that way to get this self-control. It's more believable to me that Luke would learn self-control between the time period of Return of the Jedi to The Last Jedi, which when you say those movie names that way, Return of the Jedi, Last Jedi, it's really just kind of sad what has happened here. But it's more believable to me that he would have learned self-control in that time period than it is that he'd learned to be okay with killing his nephew. The trajectory we see him on at the end of Return of the Jedi is leading him towards a Jedi lifestyle, which would include more and more consistent training. We assume. It's never shown, so we're both kind of arguing for unknowns at this point. The typical objection to this response is that that makes Luke a failure. And that's kind of the point. Luke failed. Like in Return of the Jedi, he let his fear of what he'd lose take over him, and he gave in to his desire to protect his family no matter what, even if it meant killing a family member, father or nephew. The Return of the Jedi situation, I think, gives a precedent in The Last Jedi for what Luke does in 8. Here's where I think there's a distinct difference, and it might be more of an age thing as well. I'm 40. By the time this video gets out, I will be 41. I have a best friend that I've known since I was 3, and his children consider me to be an uncle. I can tell you there is a major difference between defending your sister from a father figure and defending their parents from their own children. That main difference is that the parents themselves would not want you to kill their child. I can't think of any parent whom, if you were to ask, if it came down to me killing you or your son, who would you want me to kill? I can't think of a single parent that would say, oh yeah, go ahead and kill my son. It's just not how that works. And if you go, okay, well, that's just one parent. Now, what if it's both parents? If you're like, okay, what if I kill you and your spouse or your son? I still don't know any parent that would be like, oh yeah, go ahead and kill my son. They'd want you to save their child. That's what parenting is. In many cases, if you were to tell a set of parents that their kid would go forward in life to become a murderer, to murder millions, most parents would still tell you not to kill the kid. At least not until the absolute last possible second. And there is a big difference between trying to stop an extremely powerful villain from corrupting or even killing your sister than there is between attacking and killing a child. Another object to this is that Ben was an innocent sleeping boy, Vader was a murderer. I swear I didn't read these ahead of time. Maybe a little, but not enough to know that literally what I was saying was going to be debated a couple seconds later, I swear. So in no way can these situations be compared, but I'm betting you're about to compare them. But let's note that Luke didn't care about Vader's past. He went to save him. Only when he threatened Leia did Luke go to kill Vader in his rage. And if this object is about their ability to carry out this threat against Luke's family, then I'd say it is irrelevant. And I'd say you were wrong. Vader had an empire at his disposal. Kylo somehow has the First Order at his disposal later, but not when Luke considers killing him. If someone walks into a room with a gun and says, "I'm going to kill your family," you better believe I'm going to react. But if my nephew comes to me and does that exact same thing, with or without a weapon in his hand, I'm still going to act. But the actions are going to be far less aggressive. I'm not going to try and kill him. I'm going to try and subdue him. Because I am a 5th degree black belt. I have training, just like Luke Skywalker. And this is my nephew, my family, a person I care about. That's where the disconnect comes in. People seem to argue as if Luke's nephew is less important than Han and Leia. From my own real-life experience, I can tell you his nephew should be even more important, simply because he is the son of 2 of his closest friends. I could argue Kylo was completely able to carry out this threat, but I say the state of the person is irrelevant. And I argue they are not. A trained warrior versus a child, with or without training, is not the same thing. One of the things that every martial arts teach you is to use the minimum necessary to subdue the person. There is a major difference between a 15-year-old, even one with training, and Vader. I would say there is a major difference between fully trained Kylo Ren and Vader, but that's a story for a different day. Another side note of this, which doesn't actually get covered in these tweets because I'm adding this in after I've already read through them all. Luke goes to Crate and decides not to try and save Ben. He tells Leia flat out, "I can't save him." Why not? He went after Vader. That seems odd. It seems like it was forced in there for the plot so that Rey would be the one that would have to save them, but that's just me. Ben and Vader's state didn't matter to Luke, and the thing is they should have, which is part of the main issue we have. They made Luke forget who he was dealing with. If Luke was thinking logically about Vader being able to carry it out in Return of the Jedi, Luke wouldn't have given in to the dark side. As logically, he could Vader without anger or die trying to save him. The point of that scene was Vader was purposely pushing Luke's buttons. His friends, his family, it's a hot button item for him. We both agree on that. The thing that we don't agree on is that his nephew should have been just as important, or even more important, than Leia was in Return of the Jedi. For no reason other than Ben is Leia's child. If you add in Han, his best friend, and that this is his best friend's child, and the idea of harming Ben should never even come up. No rational thought, just pure instinct. And in The Last Jedi, this exact same instinct kicked in for Ben's threat to his family. No rationale, just pure instinct, as Luke says. I can tell you as an uncle to 8 children now, Jesus, your instinct is to protect them above everything else. Even their parents. Something happens and you naturally move to save the children. You assume the parents can take care of themselves. So when we come to this point, we're at an impasse here, and it's purely perspective. Again, as somebody who has nieces and nephews and have worked with kids through my job and things like that, the idea that Luke Skywalker could think a sleeping child was so much of a threat that on instinct he could draw a weapon on his own nephew is so hard to swallow, I'd say it was impossible. Could it have been made possible in the plot? Sure. But they would have had to have worked up to it, to that point. Just dropping it in the movie is jarring as hell. You see it differently than I do, and that's fine. This movie is divisive, and unfortunately that was by design. Now, some will object and say that Ben's dream wasn't a threat. It was just a dream. Actually, it wouldn't have been a dream at all. It would have been a force vision, something Luke should have been familiar with experiencing, as he'd been doing it for decades at this point and gotten training on it from Yoda. But this ignores the context, I'd say. It wasn't just a dream that Luke goes dumb over. There are 2 options that I conclude from the context, with the latter being more likely, in my opinion. Either this is just Luke looking into Ben's deepest desires as he said he was doing. Yeah, that's not the context I get from the movie either. Or that in trying to see Ben's desires, he saw a version of what Kylo would become, as he says he saw what Kylo. But again, we have to go back to...
Difficult to see. Always in motion is the future.
Just because he saw it doesn't mean it will happen. That's not how the Force works. Luke's vision on Dagobah was accurate, but still clouded. The Emperor's vision of how the Battle of Endor went was wrong. He'd know that visions like this aren't always what will be, but what could be. And even if they are set in stone and solid, there's the context around how they get there that is, pliable. No, with the first option, Kylo was actually wanting to kill his family. Like Luke says, he was already gone. Just because he says it doesn't make it make any more sense. There's a point where we just get to this movie not being well made. Though one could argue he didn't necessarily make this decision yet. He was desiring the dark side and at least emotionally gave into it. It was worse than Luke imagined. If someone is contemplating destroying and killing your family, that is dangerous. They are an actual threat. Thoughts and desires do matter. They are relevant. One could say Luke's first reaction would be to save Ben, as he went to save the worst man in the galaxy. But when it came to the threats, his first reaction was to annihilate the threat. That was because Luke knew Leia wouldn't be able to save herself from Vader. I love the character of Leia, but without training, Vader would either turn her or kill her. Luke had to protect his sister, even if it meant killing his own father. This is a situation that actually plays out again and again, tragically, in real life. An abusive parent being hit, or worse, by one child trying to defend another. And it's horrible that it happens in real life, but it does happen, and it makes sense in this context. The other side is it does happen also in real life where parents, family, even friends will discover that a young person is preparing to do something absolutely horrible, even kill another family member. I've never once seen that play out in real life where the person that discovers it just goes and kills the child. They always contact the parents or the police. They get the person help. That's just how it works in real life. Again, this may be an age thing. I seem to recall you mentioning in Twitter that you were 4 during the prequel era. I was 19 to 25. It may be a perspective that will change. Hell, I might have even shared your perspective when I was your age. But being the age that I am, the age that Luke was more or less in that scene, I can tell you that's not how people react. It's not how I would have reacted. And I know you could say I'm not Luke Skywalker, but I'm looking at my own life experience and assuming Luke would have the same. So I don't think that objection holds up. For the vision thing, I mean, it was a vision. In Luke's experience, they were very, very accurate. Oh boy. He was right about his friends suffering. The objection to this is that always in motion the future is. I swear I didn't read this far ahead before writing this script. They argue Yoda said this himself, so Luke should have known. I repeat, I did not read this far ahead before writing this script. It does not change my argument, however. But that's taking that line out of context. No, it isn't. That was about Yoda trying to see the friend's fate, not denying Luke's vision was accurate. He couldn't see that specific instance. So your argument is that Luke saw them suffering, so Force visions are always right. And I'll give you that. In the story, most of the Force visions we hear about, specifically Padme dying and Han and Leia being tortured on Cloud City, do come true. That's because it is a narrative of the story. It's foreshadowing. Yoda tells both Luke and Anakin that you have to be careful when interpreting the future. And Palpatine's vision didn't actually turn out the way he thought it would, unless he thought he was going to die. So with visions being mostly accurate, as we see in many places, with very few being outright wrong, it's reasonable Luke would take this seriously. 2 out of 3 were right that I can think of. We probably get more in the EU and Clone Wars, maybe Rebels, but I have a headache and they aren't coming to mind. I'm still inclined, as I was before this movie came out, to distrust visions of the future. They are used here as a story narrative, but let's say you're completely correct, and the visions are always 100% accurate. I still say, as an adult, with training, that I would not just kill my nephew, or even consider it. and the fact that Luke considers it to the point of drawing his weapon does not make sense. From that standpoint, that Luke should have had more training and world experience than I do, and be familiar with these things. Now, these are the more common objections I hear. Then there are some more emotional arguments, but I think I covered some of the more main arguments for Luke's inconsistency and objections to my objections. Now, this probably won't change one's opinion on whether they like Luke being portrayed this way, but I think at least you can see the rationale behind people saying he is consistent with his character. And this might not change your mind, but that's okay. We all have different views, and I think it important to understand each other's views on this and have compassion to those who disagree. I can see your rationale, yes, and you have clearly thought this through. What it keeps coming down to with me and the people I have these debates with is that we are viewing the same thing but seeing different aspects. You can't see my perspective, and I cannot see yours, at least not from an understanding where we think the other is accurate. I'm using my own real-world judgment and viewpoints and extrapolating out a character that helped shape those viewpoints to form the conclusion that I am coming to. I suspect many others are as well. Are we wrong? Maybe. Or maybe it just doesn't make sense. And I would say that if as many people as have had an issue with this kind of thing come forward to say, hey, this doesn't make sense to me, this feels wrong, this is inconsistent, then maybe the movie itself did a bad job of portraying it. Could I envision a future where Luke would try to kill his own nephew, fail, lose hope, lose faith, abandon everyone, even the family he was worried would be killed, despite not having stopped the person that was supposed to kill them, and hide out on an island in the middle of nowhere? Sure, I could envision it. But you damn well better have a great story that is well thought out leading up to that point. That is the failure of The Last Jedi. Not what it did, but that it didn't bother to flesh it out. It's what it didn't do that is the problem. Me, personally, at first, I hated Luke. But these conclusions I came to on my own have really changed my mind on his consistency. And even then, I still hated the way he was portrayed. But it has since then grown on me. The theme on family hit close to home, and I loved it. So that's my thoughts on it. Any thought will be appreciated. God bless, and may the Force be with you. One thing that came to mind while I was wrapping this up is that one of the arguments made earlier was that we assume Luke wouldn't have grown or changed. The idea that change has to be justified. It just dawned on me here that your argument kind of assumes that Luke hasn't changed at all from Return of the Jedi. They still have him reacting to Ben the way he reacted to Vader. You even mentioned that it's unusual to assume that Anakin in Phantom Menace would be exactly like Vader, that Anakin has an arc. So the problem here is that your argument kind of assumes that Luke's arc stopped after Return of the Jedi, that he would still react as he did in his youth. My arguments rely on the idea that he would have still had an arc, one that in my mind is based on his original trajectory, snippets of things I've seen Luke in, like in the expanded universe and video games, and a little of my own life experience to come to the conclusion that he shouldn't do what he did. The problem is we are both filling in the 15 to 30 year gap with our own interpretations of what we think would happen and where the character would be. I think everyone is in one way or another. The problem is the movie doesn't. It doesn't give us any clues to Luke's arc up until the vision. For you, it fits because you're able to see parallels with scenes in previous films. For me, it doesn't, because I view those scenes differently and expect the character would have continued to grow from who he was. So, who's right? We may never know. This has been a fun discussion, and I'd love to hear any and all thoughts on the two sides of this debate in the comments below. Thank you all for watching. Have a good day. The most Jeez, fucked up right off the bat. Dude, your post is 24 tweets. Limited. Happy birthday to me. I mean, he should have been experienced. Shit. What the hell does that actually say?